Hi everybody, this is Katje. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I hope that everybody had a happy Halloween, a happy All Saints Day, and a happy All Souls Day, and also a happy Dia de los Muertos for those of you who celebrate that. I hope everybody enjoyed those holidays. They are now past us. And what I want to do tonight is go back to two of the subjects that I really enjoy discussing most of all, and those are philosophy and theology, especially in connection with each other. So tonight I'm wearing a kind of sexy, intellectual, quasi-intellectual outfit that's sort of sexy and smart, I hope, to set the appropriate mood for this particular video that I hope you will enjoy. So the theme of my remarks this evening is the idea of a paradox. What I want to do is say something about different kinds of paradoxes and then slowly work my way towards a kind of new angle from which to come at some of the material that I've discussed, theological material that I have discussed in previous videos. So this is about paradox, different kinds of paradoxes, and how we might relate that to certain issues in theology. So let's begin with the notion of a paradox. Now, the first thing to notice about this is that some paradoxes are ones that we really can't do anything with. So for example, suppose that we took the paradox of something that is both a square and a square circle. Now, that's the idea of a square circle is kind of a dead end. We really can't do anything with that. For example, if I were to ask you to take the area, to calculate the area of a square circle, well, you wouldn't really know where to begin. Nobody would know what to do with that instruction. So this is an example of a paradox that we really can't do anything with, a paradox that is an intellectual dead end. Another example would be something like, well, right now it is raining heavily here and simultaneously not raining here. It's both raining and not raining here heavily at the same time. That's a contradiction. And once again, if we were to hear that, we would just sort of be completely puzzled and not what to do with it. So that's another kind of dead-end paradox. But not all paradoxes are necessarily dead ends. Sometimes there's a way of thinking beyond the paradox. So let me give you an example of that comes from the philosophy of logic and the philosophy of language. And this is a so-called liar paradox. And an example of that would be something like, suppose I were to utter the statement, well, this statement that I am now uttering is not true. Now, very easily one can show that if that statement is true, then since it says that it's not true, it's not true. But on the other hand, since it's not true, and it says that it's not true, then the statement would be true. So very easily, when you begin to reflect on that kind of statement, the liar statement, you can deduce a contradiction. So one might think, well, this is like a square circle, or the example of it's both raining and not raining here at the same time. But that's not quite right, because if we step back and think about this sentence from a sort of broader interpretive perspective, it becomes possible to say, well, look, maybe in the original context in which this sentence was uttered, it doesn't really say anything true or false. But there is a sense that when we step back and look at the sentence from a kind of broader vantage point, well, since it says that it's not true, and if it says that it's not true, then since it's not true, it doesn't say anything true, and it says that it's not true. Well, from broader perspective, it is true. It does say something true, but not immediately. It's only when we step back to a kind of richer, broader interpretive perspective that we can say, well, look, since if it doesn't say anything true, and it says that it's not true, well, then there's a sense in which it's true. But that doesn't come immediately. We have to step back and reflect on the original use of the sentence, which is neither true nor false. And then since that's not true, it's neither true nor false, then it's not true. And from the broader perspective, since the sentence says that it's not true, then we can say, okay, well now we can see that there's a sense in which it is true, and we could go on with that indefinitely. I just want to give that example because it shows that there are paradoxes that don't dead end, but that we can continue to think about, and that we might actually attach some kind of coherent sense to it from a broader interpretive perspective. A lot more could be said about that, but I think that's enough for right now, because what I want to do at this point is shift our attention to the theological issues, some of which I have been discussing in earlier videos. So we might think of the following paradox, what Kierkegaard calls the paradox of Christ. So according to Christian teaching, Jesus Christ is supposed to be completely human, but also completely divine simultaneously. And so when we initially encounter this statement of faith, well, Jesus is both completely human and completely divine, our immediate reaction to that might be, well, we don't really understand how that could possibly be true. How could something be both human and divine in the fullest sense of those two terms? That doesn't really seem to be possible. So our initial reaction to this paradox of Christ might be similar to our reaction to the idea of a square circle, or to the idea of it's both raining and not raining here simultaneously. We don't really know what to make of it. But when we step back to a broader perspective, we can begin to assign different meanings to that paradox, to that paradoxical statement, some of which are false, but some of which might also be true. So that when we begin to do that, the paradox of Christ that Kierkegaard describes begins to look more like the paradox of the liar sentence, where initially it doesn't say anything true or false, but from a broader perspective, it might say something, in some instances, false, and in other instances, true. So let's take an example of stepping back to a broader interpretive perspective, a broader theological perspective, if you will, on this paradox of Christ, and coming up with false interpretations of it. So one false interpretation of it is to say, well, what really is going on here is that Christ is fully divine, but he simply appears to be human. It's almost like a phantasm or an illusion of being a human that this godly being, this divine being, takes on as kind of an appearance, but it's almost like a ghost. The human side of Christ is simply an apparition, whereas Christ in his essence is divine. Now, this is known as Docetism, and it's a heresy according to traditional and orthodox Christian teaching, Christian orthodoxy, because it affirms the divinity of Christ, but it denies his humanity by saying, well, that's just an illusion. It's not really something that really pertains to Jesus Christ. So that's one false interpretation that we might come up with from a broader perspective when we reflect on the original paradox. There's another one, too, and that goes the other way, where we say, well, look, Jesus was a human being, fully a human being, and he wasn't really divine. He simply was a very astute teacher. He was a very conscientious and morally aware person. Maybe he was in some way very, very gifted and had these insights, but he was really nothing more than a human teacher who happened to be an exemplary example of morality and spirituality. And so this is the heresy of what Kierkegaard calls rationalism, because it affirms Christ's humanity fully, but it really denies his divinity, and simply treats him as someone who happens to be an exemplary teacher, an almost godlike teacher, but not really a god. So those are two false interpretations of the paradox of Christ that we might devise from a broader perspective when we reflect on the original statement. But there's another way of going here, and I want to begin to describe this evening, and then come back to it in more detail later in a subsequent video. This is an idea or a way of interpreting the paradox that is suggested, to me at least, by what Kierkegaard calls in Fear and Trembling, infinite resignation. So infinite resignation is something that Abraham, in the story of Abraham, God and Isaac, where God commands Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, whom God has given to Abraham and Sarah in their old age, and then God turns around and asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and Abraham doesn't even hesitate. He complies with that, or he goes through the motions of taking Isaac to the mountain and preparing him for the sacrifice, and then at the last moment, God's angel intervenes and prevents that from happening. But up to that point, Abraham, as presented by Kierkegaard, is fully prepared to go through with God's command because he loves God. And Kierkegaard, writing in Fear and Trembling through one of his personae, says, well, this is really astounding. I mean, when I look at this person and how he's willing to do this and go through this infinite resignation, even suppose that he doesn't have any expectation of getting Isaac back. As a matter of fact, he may believe on faith that he does, but the idea of infinite resignation comes before faith. That's the willingness to do something like that, even if you believe that you may very well never get it back. So Abraham shows himself willing to submit to this command, this divine command, even if he will never get Isaac back. That's infinite resignation. And that's part of Abraham's human nature. That's something that potentially, at least, the rest of us might do under certain circumstances. Now, when we shift to Jesus of Nazareth, and let's look at his nature. He's a human being, but he also is capable of infinite resignation, let's say. And that would be that Christ would be willing to go to the cross and offer himself up as a sacrifice, even if he knew that nobody would ever accept him or have faith in him, even if he knew that no one would be saved through that. He might be willing to go through that sacrifice, to submit himself to God's command, the Father's command, even though he knows that no one will be saved through that. Now, as a matter of fact, they will, but he would be willing to do it even if that weren't the case. And even more radically, one might suggest, Christ, in his nature, would be willing to actually even allow himself to be damned for all eternity if that's what God commanded out of love of God. Now that's a radical thing that the rest of us, I think, would not be capable of. We probably wouldn't even be capable or willing of sacrificing ourselves for a completely futile purpose on a cross or in some other way of being executed simply because God commanded us to do so and because we love God. But, and here's the important point that I want to make this evening in preparation for later videos, and that is that when we look at Abraham's human nature, which he shares with us, is characterized by infinite resignation. Maybe to a lesser degree than the human nature of Christ, but there is infinite resignation in Abraham and in our human nature, and this same infinite resignation can be found in Christ's nature, except here it's even more intense. It's at an even higher degree of intensity. It's even more radical, and there we might feel it is really beginning to approach, the human nature itself is beginning to approximate a divine nature, because really only a God or a godlike being would be capable of sacrificing itself for people whom will never take advantage of that sacrifice by having faith, or maybe even be willing to suffer eternal damnation simply because of love of divinity or love of himself or love of the Godhead. That's where the same nature that we share with Abraham, that's also to be found in Jesus of Nazareth, begins to come closer to divinity. And we might want to say that this nature here in Christ is both human, because it's something that he shares with us, but also divine, because it's something that operates under the characteristic of infinite resignation to a much higher and a much more extraordinary degree than we are capable of doing. So in that sense, we reach a level of interpretation, a broader and a richer level of theological interpretation, where we can say of Christ that he is both fully human like us and also fully divine, because he has infinite resignation like us, but he has it to an extraordinary degree, a godlike degree, unlike us, and that's where the paradox becomes something that we can negotiate. That's where the paradox of Christ becomes something that is not a dead end, that is not simply subject to false interpretations like the two heresies I previously mentioned, but actually has a true interpretation that enables us to make sense of it. So that's what I wanted to mention tonight and submit for your reflection. Now, what I want to do in subsequent videos, if I have the opportunity for that, is to extend this kind of thinking to different levels of interpretation beyond infinite resignation. In Kierkegaard, infinite resignation, especially on our part, is not yet the same as faith. Basic faith, that is belief in God as a Trinitarian being, or a Trinitarian actuality. And furthermore, basic faith in God as a Trinitarian actuality, which is something that even Satan and the demons have, because they believe in God, they believe that he exists and that he's a Trinity. That's not yet the same level, the even richer level of believing in Christ and having faith in Christ that has a salvific effect, that is, believing in Christ and accepting his sacrifice in a way that leads to one's eternal salvation. That's the highest level of faith, or the highest level of theological interpretation, that I want to come back to in a later video. Again, it's something that I have discussed previously, but I want to come at it from a different angle this time, because I think there's a better way, perhaps, of understanding that content than the way I suggested previously. So that's what I wanted to talk about this evening. Again, I wish everybody a very peaceful and a restful and a relaxing good night. I hope that everybody had a wonderful Halloween, and I certainly appreciate your spending time with me again. I really do care about each one of you. Please take care of each other. Please take care of yourself. Until next time, this is Katje wishing everybody a wonderful good night, and I'll see you next time. Thanks again for joining me. Bye-bye.